What if Minecraft forests looked like this? I'm going to be updating 5 forest biomes using custom worldgen features to give them a total makeover, both above ground and below. Join me as I turn this overworld into an overrealm. First, let's examine Minecraft's current forests through a worldgen lens. We're going to be taking a look at specifically the forest and windswept forest biomes, the birch and old-growth birch biomes, and the flower forest. All the trees in these forest biomes are, of course, tree feature types. We have simple ones like the straight trunk placers that have these blob foliage shapes on top of them, which are used for both the oak trees and birch trees, though there's a few different sizes, and those have size ranges. And then we also have the fancy oak trees, which are much taller and have these extra branches so that the same blob shapes end up looking a little bit more natural. And of course, as of 1.21.5, many of these tree features also have a bunch of this leaf litter on the ground, which is actually placed as part of the feature as a decorator. All of these individual tree features are actually placed by one single placed feature that is listed in the biome file that randomly selects between all of them. So it has a very consistent density of trees throughout the entire biome, but still can have some randomness in which trees get spawned. So for example, obviously we have a mixture of the oak and birch trees. Most of the oak trees are this regular oak, and then sometimes they're the fancy oak. Each of these are separate features and they just have different chances for getting selected. Step 1 of giving these biomes a makeover is of course to change these tree features to look different/better, but we'll probably borrow the same mechanic that vanilla uses to actually place them by having a single feature so that we can control that density, that frequency that each of the individual tree features gets placed at, and then we'll randomly select which tree feature we want to place. Like most biomes in the overworld, we obviously have plenty of other vegetation in the form of short and tall grass, patches of flowers, and in the birch forest in particular, these wildflowers. And although they're rare, we can get pumpkin patches in this biome, although this patch consists of what seems to be exactly one pumpkin, which is pretty uncommon. Although all these plants are a pretty small feature practically from the player perspective as they explore these biomes, we're going to be overhauling the system that places all of these little blocks and features quite a lot, and hopefully making some ground cover that looks much more natural and forest-like in the process. Speaking of the ground, the surface of these biomes is of course handled by the surface rules, which are sort of a global thing across the entire overworld or the entire dimension period, and handles the blocks that the actual terrain is made of. For all the biomes I'll be messing with today, that surface is grass blocks with some layers of dirt, and I'm not going to be changing that because I don't want to have to touch the surface rules at all. I want to change all these biomes, update them using only features. However, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stick with the same grass block layer across the entirety of these biomes. I'll make use of some other features, I think, to mix things up and give them just a little bit more texture and character. And on the subject of character, I think it would be really cool if we made the caves, the underground for all of these forest biomes, visually distinct from the caves you might find in other biomes, and of course, indeed, between one another. I don't plan to go all out totally full and unique cave biomes like lush caves and dripstone caves, but just some additional texturing for the floor and ceilings and some extra features that you can find inside of these caves to really tell that you are in a forest cave without of course disrupting your ability to mine ores, the main reason that you'll be exploring them. So I think the best way to get started is by clearing away everything that I don't plan on using. Much better. So much more room to breathe. Now, of course, to make this a proper forest, we'll need to start by adding some trees. We'll have a few different varieties of trees, but I think I'm going to make them a fair bit taller than the trees that one would normally find in an oak forest. I'll probably use the fancy trunk provider so that we can have some of these branches as well. Also not sure that I'm going to stick with the same blob shape for the foliage provider. I'll probably use something that's a little more natural, like maybe dark oak, or perhaps the cherry leaf provider. Additionally, I don't want these trees to look like just sticks kind of poking up out of the ground or just kind of on the ground, unconnected to it. So I think I'm going to make use of the roots that got added with the mangrove trees to generally give them a little bit of a wider footprint. We'll try to keep the canopy of leaves about 4 to 5 blocks tall at the lowest so that you can walk under the entire canopy of the forest without getting your face stuffed full of leaves and running into things all the time. But of course, you'll still have to potentially hop over some of these roots that I think we'll be able to make dig into the ground as well, so we can get some awesome shapes like that. Now, in the vanilla forest, we obviously have the regular trees and then the fancy trees, but if we're using the fancy trunk provider for the majority of the trees here, then we need something else to be the sort of fancier version of them. So I'm thinking I'll probably use one of the 2 wide trunk placers, either dark oak or maybe the mega jungle tree if the branches don't look too strange. We'll make these quite a bit taller, but still give them the same foliage provider that we give the other trees, so that they just look like larger, older versions of the same type of tree. And to go along with that, I think we'll probably make their roots much wider as well, as best as we can with the weird behavior that roots have with 2 wide trees. The vanilla forest also has some birch trees in addition to the oak trees, though I think I'll probably make them a lot less common, but still enough that you'll be able to see them. I'm going to make them quite a bit taller and probably also give them the same kind of footprint of roots as well. In real life, birch trees also have their leaves much closer to them. Their branches and leaves don't really stretch out too far from their very straight trunks. And I think we'll replicate the same behavior here. Maybe a little bit of a shape on top. This should be very doable with the spruce foliage provider. And just help these in particular stick out a little bit more compared to the other oak trees that we'll be finding here. I'm sure I'll come up with a few different birch designs when we actually get to the birch forest proper, but for now, these are just to add a little bit of visual variety to the forest. In most vanilla biomes, short and tall grass are pretty common, but I think in this forest biome, I want to have it primarily be ferns and maybe some large ferns as well. In vanilla, these are normally only found in some of the colder biomes like taigas, but they really make a lot of sense in any kind of a forest. They're kind of just smaller ferns. They're not necessarily trees, they're not bushes, but they do tend to grow around a lot of trees. And so I think I'm actually going to make the generation of these ferns way more common and just denser ground cover compared to anything that we'd find in vanilla Minecraft biomes. We'll also, of course, have some patches of poppies and dandelions as well. Those appear in most vanilla biomes. And then in most forests, we also have things like rose bushes and lilacs spawning in less common patches. Vanilla Minecraft tends to use the random patch feature to place things like flowers and short grass and ferns and things, but I actually think I'm going to try something different here. Let's put all this together and take a look at what it looks like, and then we'll see if there's anything else that we need to add to round out the forest. Oh wow, this is already a huge change. It's like a jungle over here. Now, what's interesting here is this doesn't really look very good from up here, from this aerial view, but I think I'm okay with that, and I'd almost even say that it's intentional. You see, personally, I catch myself a lot, and I feel like some other worldgen devs may find themselves in a similar predicament where I get really caught up with the appearance of my custom biomes from the air, from afar, and that really isn't the way that most players are going to engage with this custom worldgen. You really have to come down to the ground, to the player perspective, to get a full picture of what the actual player experience is going to be playing through this game. Aerial screenshots work really well for promotional materials to get people to download the pack, but it's visuals like this that are going to get people to play and stay with the pack and come back for more. And this visual right here, I think just perfectly encapsulate everything that I want out of this forest. We got the canopy, the leaves, about 4 or 5 blocks above us most of the time. We obviously have some gaps in the trees and some places where they get just a little bit lower for sure, and a little bit higher as the branches are higher up. Because the trees are far more dense than vanilla forests, we have way more of these leaf particles that you're really engaging with and interacting with much more frequently. And as you're walking through the forest, most of these trees are clearly taking up their space. These roots branch out a very nice distance to give them just a little bit of character until you find a really large tree like this that really stands out. Like, whoa, this tree is old, it is huge, it is awesome, and the roots tell the same story. Now, of course, I'm sure none of you failed to notice the podzol here on the ground, and this is being added by an altar ground decorator of most of these trees. My logic is, since most of them also have place on ground decorators for the leaf litter here, which is now a staple, I think, of forest biomes, and we obviously have way more of those leaf particles, like I mentioned, naturally, much more of these leaves would be kind of collecting on the ground and rotting and decaying and kind of caking the surface in their kind of brown, rotten leaf litter. And I think podzol really captures that texture and appearance so well, much better than just leaf litter blocks on top of solid grass everywhere. You'll notice on some of these trees we have brown or red mushrooms. Those are part of the root provider, so I've given it a small chance that one of them is able to spawn on top of the roots, again, just to give them a little bit more character, maybe provide some extra food sources, something like that. I've added a few decorators to some of these trees in pursuit of that same kind of characterization of these huge structures that you're going to encounter so much in these forests. For example, the birch trees here, in addition to the roots, I also gave them a chance to have these brown mushroom blocks sticking out from the trunk. They do look a little out of place, especially when they're of course right below a leaf block, but I think they just add that little bit of extra oomph to the shape of this tree and the color scheme, frankly, and make it seem like, okay, things are growing in this forest and dying, frankly, because these are mushrooms. All of these trees also have the same chance for bee nests as part of the bee decorator type as vanilla trees do, but since there are just way more trees in these forests than normal, we can expect probably more bee nests per forest than we would get in a vanilla forest biome. Moving on from the trees, we obviously have way more coverage for these small and large ferns, and I've also added some bushes here as well. Like I mentioned, I opted not to use any random patches like vanilla does to place all of these various plant blocks. Instead, they're just simple block features, so every feature is only trying to place a single fern block, for example, but then as part of the placement modifiers in the place feature, I'm multiplying the number of spawn attempts that each of those blocks is getting so that they have multiple chances to spawn, and that ends up having pretty massive coverage of most of the forest. One feature places small ferns with a chance for large ferns in pretty much every chunk, while another feature uses a noise-based count to place the large ferns in larger quantities in specific chunks. So over here, we have mostly the small ferns with some large ferns, but as we fly over here, we have several chunks kind of all clustered together where the large ferns count happen to be much higher thanks to the noise. The bushes and flowers work a little bit differently. They instead are using a rarity filter to only generate in some chunks and then multiplying their spawn attempts across that chunk, but by a smaller amount than the ferns and large ferns were. Each of those multiplied spawn attempts then gets randomly distributed across the chunk and then projects to a height map up here on the surface if there is a valid spawning position for it. Now, the pumpkins I have working a little bit differently. In vanilla, those are also handled by a random patch, but I've not done the same thing that I did with the ferns and flowers to place some simple blocks. Instead, the pumpkins are actually placed by a place on ground decorator for a variant of these other oak trees. Instead of placing leaf litter, probably this tree here is my guess, maybe this one, is randomly distributing some pumpkins on the ground around it. The difference is pretty subtle, especially from the player perspective, but my hope and my idea with it is that these pumpkins will only be able to generate around trees and ideally under trees. Obviously, we don't have any trees over here outside of the forest biome because they stretched a little bit further away, which is fine. But I like the idea that pumpkins are just going to generally be more common around trees rather than having the potential to generate kind of in a clearing. Now, speaking of clearings, there really aren't any here, and I think I would like to add some. So I'm probably going to add some new features to space things out a little bit. Probably some kind of like a desire line or the implication of one where the grass and plants and things would have been trampled away, and specifically where trees won't be able to grow on, so that we get some more natural gaps between the trees. I'll probably add some ponds for a similar reason. I generally want trees to be pretty dense across the forest, but I do want there to be some gaps in the tree line where you can kind of sit and catch your breath. So let's get those added. If you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen structures and data pack content. If you're excited to explore the forests of the overworld yourself, please consider joining my Patreon to get early access. And if you'd like to learn how to get into custom world gen, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide created for Datapack Hub. It isn't quite updated with information on 1.21.11's new environment attribute system, but should have everything you need to create custom features like this. So here's what we're looking at for the desire lines. They definitely aren't like true desire lines, as if they're trails where animals or people might have walked consistently on the same path many times, but they do get the general idea across, where you could travel from this patch of coarse dirt over to this patch of coarse dirt and make your way through the forest relatively easily without having to jump over a bunch of roots and things. I'm creating these desire lines with a basic implementation of a concept called feature stacking. Feature stacking broadly is the art of placing multiple features relative to one another, either in the same spot or under certain conditions that get fulfilled by earlier placed features. So the way these are getting handled is I have a feature that has a rarity filter, so it only places in some chunks. You'll see that we have a bunch of this coarse dirt over here, but there isn't any over here in this chunk. This particular chunk got skipped, and then we've got some more over here. That feature's spawn attempts then get multiplied, randomly distributed up here on the surface with a height map, and then place some disks of gravel. That's right, not coarse dirt. I'm actually placing gravel first, and the reason for that is because gravel is a pretty natural block, so if it gets missed by the later feature that turns it into coarse dirt, that's okay. But plants like ferns, bushes, flowers, and importantly trees can't grow on gravel. They aren't able to survive there, and so the spawn attempts that try to place there end up getting skipped, which is how we get some leaf litter over here on this coarse dirt from the tree over here, but you'll notice there's no trees and no ferns and things on this desire line. I then have a feature placed later, after all the trees and ferns and things, that is a vegetation patch feature. It's very, very wide and places in every single chunk exactly one time, and just replaces any gravel that it finds on the surface with coarse dirt. And I'm specifically having to do this because I want the desire lines to very clearly block out some areas of the ground that things can't generate on, which is why I'm using the gravel, but I want the desire lines to be coarse dirt, which of course is a block that ferns and flowers and trees and things can survive on. So I have to turn it into the coarse dirt after the fact. Now, the other reason that I picked gravel, like I mentioned, is in case it gets missed by that vegetation patch feature and doesn't get turned into the coarse dirt. That's able to happen because of the way that chunks load in order. So for example, in this particular chunk, we clearly didn't get any desire lines. We didn't get any disks of the gravel, but the vegetation patch feature that replaces gravel with coarse dirt did still get placed. This chunk generated first, placed that feature. Okay, let's move on to the next chunk. This chunk does have desire lines, so it places the disks of gravel first, including one that happens to be just around or just outside the edge of that chunk, which of course is possible just due to the random distribution. That goes ahead and places all those disks of gravel, and then the vegetation patch gets placed in the middle of that chunk, but unfortunately isn't big enough to stretch into the next chunk. And because this chunk already had that vegetation patch feature placed since it generated earlier, this little bit of gravel ends up getting skipped. In theory, there may be ways to mitigate this even further by placing some additional vegetation patches, making the vegetation patches a little larger, things like that. But I, again, specifically picked gravel so that if this does happen, the few edge cases where it does happen, it's really not that big of a deal. These ponds here, for one, turned out really awesome. I really love how this one has the tree sitting in the middle of it. That's so cool. These ponds work in a very similar way and are going to utilize a more advanced version of feature stacking. You'll notice here we of course still have a group of disks that are replacing the ground with water or seagrass, and then any blocks below that with sand. You can tell they're disks because they have this rounding along the edges here, which I'm totally fine with. However, unlike the desire lines, the feature that is placing all these disks of water is not the feature that has a rarity filter. This is actually attempting to get placed in every single chunk. These ponds use, or are going to use, a method of feature stacking that was popularized by Apollo called marker block feature stacking. Down here on the surface, everything looks fine, but directly above this pond, up in the sky, we have some red concrete blocks. Marker block feature stacking is a more advanced method of feature stacking that is necessary if you plan to have features that are much more closely related and placed relative to each other without strictly replacing one another. It involves placing a simple block feature way up in the sky, in this case with a rarity filter, so it's only in some of the chunks, and then afterwards placing a vegetation patch feature also up in the sky that is only able to replace that marker block, in this case red concrete. That attempts to place in every single chunk, just like the one that replaces the gravel with coarse dirt for the desire lines, but since it can only replace red concrete, it only ever finds those marker blocks, and just replaces it with red concrete once again. However, the other thing that vegetation patch feature is doing is placing a feature, a vegetation feature, as part of the vegetation patch, since it was successfully able to replace that block, even though it was with itself. That vegetation feature is the disks, well, this cloud's in the way. That vegetation feature is what is placing all the multiplied spawn attempts for those disks of water down on the ground using a height map. Now, of course, this isn't the full feature stack. There isn't any need for marker block feature stacking for just what I have here. And that's why, of course, those marker blocks are still up in the sky. I'm going to add one more feature that replaces that marker block with air, and at the same time places another vegetation feature to have some firefly bushes populate the shores of this disk. Let me show you what I mean. So now, if we look up in the sky, there are no more red concrete blocks. All the marker blocks have been replaced with a vegetation patch feature, and the vegetation feature itself placed a bunch of spawn attempts multiplied of simple block features that place these firefly bushes, and they have some block predicate filters so that they're only able to generate beside water. In this case, looks like we only got a few over here, but if we go over this direction to some of the other ponds that we know generated earlier, I bet we'll see plenty more. Got a couple more firefly bushes down here on this little hill pond, and another group of 4 over here with these ponds. This powerful use case for vegetation patch features, the broad applicability, and the fact that it is so widely unknown outside of the niche worldgen community are exactly why vegetation patch features are S tier. Now, I'll probably return to add a few more things to the regular forest biome, especially because we'll have to come back later to add the cave features underground. But before I do that, I think it's time to address the giant empty gap that is the birch forests. So let's start planning how we want to populate this area. Unlike vanilla forests, birch forests do only consist of birch trees, and to try to replicate a similar kind of realistic style that the forest has, I think I'll make the birch trees even more populous than in the vanilla forest. Unlike the regular forest biome, birch forests do only consist of birch trees, and to kind of keep up with the same kind of realistic approach that I'm doing for these forest biomes, I think I'll make the birch trees way more common and frequent in the birch forest than they were over in the regular forest. Particularly because they are so skinny that it shouldn't really make it that much more difficult to navigate through. We of course do still have the birch tree that has the roots, and I think that'll make an appearance here, but to kind of help with the fact that there will be so many more birch trees, I'll probably make most of them not have roots, and that should still keep up with the vision and visual that I want for the birch forest, since real life birch trees don't tend to have really wide roots that stretch out. Of course, we are going to need a fancy birch tree variant, so we'll once again do a really tall old birch tree, and this one for sure is going to have roots, just like the one that we did for the oak trees. Now, there will still be ferns here, but I think I'd really like for most of the birch forest ground to be covered in short and tall grass, particularly short grass with some tall grass kind of mixed throughout. Maybe I'll do the same kind of noise-based count for the tall grass that I did for the tall ferns, but I won't have such tall ferns in the birch forest. Technically, in real life, grass like this isn't that common, especially not these grass blocks that really look like a mowed lawn or something. These don't tend to happen very often in nature, or at least not in very large areas, which is part of why I did the podzol and the ferns over there. But I think here in the birch forest, it's going to add a lot of vibrancy and make it just look way more verdant, which I think is appropriate given how bright the birch forest tends to feel because of the white logs. Birch forests are also made bright by their very common wildflowers, which I definitely will need to make way more common than the flowers in the other forest there, because in the vanilla birch forest, they are super common, and I think that just adds a lot of character. We don't want them to be too dominating because we do still want the kind of 3D aspect to the surface that the short and tall grass offers, but I think we can make sure that there are a lot of them still. And just like with the regular forest, we will still include some desire lines of coarse dirt, though I think it probably won't be necessary to have such wide clearings as in the other forest. We should be able to make these much more sparse and smaller. Let's see how all those ideas actually look, not just on paper. This area here appears to be an old growth birch forest, which of course we haven't gotten to yet, but it is surrounded by a very large regular birch forest. Perhaps even more so than the oak forest, the birch forest doesn't necessarily look great from above, but again, that is very much not the point. This isn't the way that most players are going to be engaging with it and viewing it. If we come down to the surface, this looks, I think, just absolutely perfect. We do have the desire lines here, and they are much smaller than before, and there generally shouldn't be as many of them. We've got another one over here, and probably another off this way. Yep, so one over here. So you can still kind of follow them, but this is perhaps a less traveled forest than the regular forest. I think it was definitely the right call to have most of these trees not have roots. It makes the ones that do have roots stand out just a little bit more, even if they aren't the tall, fancy ones like this. We've also got the foliage offset quite high up the birch trees so that once again, you generally have a lot of walking and jumping room. I think this is particularly important in the latest update where horses are in theory much more prominent. Because we have so many more trees, we obviously have way more chances for these brown mushroom blocks to generate on the logs. And I think with the added context and the surroundings of having multiple of them in the same area, they end up looking a lot better. All of the short grass that you see here is actually being placed by place on ground decorators from these trees. I opted to do that instead of having leaf litter here because for most of these trees, the leaf litter wouldn't really make sense since the leaves hug them pretty closely. Some of these trees do have wider brims though, and the mega fancy birch trees are placing some leaf litter as their place on ground decorator. Fortunately, that didn't seem to hinder the placement of the wildflowers, and walking through here, yes, we do definitely still have very dense short and tall grass. The tall grass, of course, coming from a separate feature, being handled the same way as the ferns, but doesn't interfere with the wildflowers and vice versa. We do still have the forest flower feature here, placing the rose bushes and lilacs and things, same as the other forest. And I also made a variant of birch tree that has the same pumpkin placed on ground decorator. This patch happened to be particularly small, probably because it's on a hill. I am very satisfied with how both of these forests have turned out so far, but before we get to the old growth forest, as well as the windswept forest, which probably is somewhere far away from here, I think it's time to go underground and plan how we want to decorate the caves of these biomes. When it comes to decorating caves, there really is no better blueprint than the Lush Caves biome. Even though I don't want these caves to be quite as populated and dense as the Lush Caves, we'll still end up using the same kind of mechanics in order to populate them at all. Lush Caves use a very high count of vegetation patch features, both for the ceiling as well as for the floor, like over here, that replaces some of the surface, in this case with moss blocks, and then places another vegetation feature that is just some simple blocks for short and tall grass, azalea bushes, and the moss carpet. This particular cave is very spacious, so it ends up looking quite sparse, but if you've been in a lush cave biome before, you know how dense it can be and how much floor and ceiling coverage there can be with this system, and so we'll be using that in our caves as well. I'm thinking for the oak forest caves, we'll have a floor that's kind of a mixture of dirt and tuff, and we'll make the ceiling a mixture of dirt and rooted dirt, which I think will make it look like the roots from the forest are kind of growing down onto the ceilings of these caves. We'll have some sparse ferns growing on the dirt of the caves, probably much more sparse than this, just to give it a little bit of extra life and character. And similarly, I'll add some hanging roots from the rooted dirt of the ceiling, since normally you only find these connected to the root systems of azalea trees above lush caves. The goal isn't to necessarily completely transform the caves below these forests into whole cave biomes, but just to distinguish them and make them stand out from the surrounding caves of other biomes, and generally make them just more interesting than a bunch of different stone variants. We'll probably leave the ceilings of the birch forest pretty much the same. I don't think there's any better way to kind of iterate on it for a forest biome like this, but I think for the floor, I'm going to make it mostly diorite with small patches of grass that will be surrounded by yet more diorite. We'll have maybe some ferns and grass and things on there, but mostly some wildflowers, which I think will just add some beautiful color to the otherwise very white and gray birch caves. Let's put those together and see how they look. Let's start with the regular forest caves. The combination of the dirt and tuff I think worked out really well, and because of the crisscrossing nature of caves, we do get some situations where some rooted dirt even ends up on the ground because it's being placed there by the ceiling vegetation patch of a lower cave. Now, I ended up deciding to go with short grass instead of the small ferns for most of the vegetation here because it ended up just feeling a little bit better. The ferns, I guess, were just a little too pointy. They just didn't fit very well for the caves compared to the short grass. They're great for the surface, but not so much down here. Mixed in with the short grass, I also have some oak saplings being placed by the same simple block feature and just a weighted state provider to randomly select between them. Those are the vegetation feature getting placed by the vegetation patches that are handling the ground cover. The ceiling vegetation patches also have a weighted state provider for their simple block vegetation feature so that we can have a mixture of hanging roots and occasional oak logs hanging from the ceiling as well, almost like these are particularly thick roots breaking through the ceiling. Of course, they don't go anywhere, they're not block columns or anything, I just have them sticking down from the ceiling. What's really cool about using vegetation patches to handle this ground cover is I can make it so that they're able to replace things like stone, diorite, granite, and even dirt and gravel, but not any exposed ores that are on the floor or the ceiling. So we can still get those easy to see ores that players can mine to. And in fact, it makes it even easier to identify those ore blocks. Because we are using tough blocks for the ground, this does mean that we do get some deep slate ore variants up here above the deep slate level. If anything, it makes the deep slate coal ore variant more common of a block if people wanted to collect those. You'll notice as well these small individual bush blocks as well as these larger oak bushes that are populating some of the ground. These are being placed by a separate feature rather than as part of the vegetation patch. These are being placed by the same feature, which is randomly selected between placing either one of these oak bushes or a small collection of multiplied placement attempts for these simple block bushes. That way I'm able to handle their distribution within a given chunk in much the same way I do on the surface. All of this together completely transforms the appearance of this cave, so it doesn't necessarily add or change anything practically to how you explore the cave, other than needing to potentially dig through a little more dirt and tuff to get to some exposed stone. Oh, looks like one of those saplings ended up growing up into a tree. But it does make finding and exploring a forest cave notably different than the caves you might find underneath a plains or something, at least right now. If we continue to travel down this cave, you'll see that I've also made some deep slate variants of the same vegetation patches that have just a little bit different block palette and chances. As you get below the deep slate level, the chance for those vegetation features in the form of short grass as well as the hanging roots and things is going to be fairly reduced from higher up in the world. You're also going to get cobbled deep slate instead of tuff and coarse dirt for the ground instead of regular dirt. Similarly, you're not going to have any rooted dirt on the ceiling anymore. It's going to be mostly coarse dirt with some regular dirt. The bush blocks and oak bushes, however, are unchanged between the deep slate level and higher up in the world. As we move from the regular forest into the birch forest, we get quite a different picture. As promised, the floor of the birch forest caves is primarily diorite, though I am using a weighted state provider so that we get some sparse individual blocks of grass. Where there is grass, we are able to get the same simple block vegetation feature that places either short grass or, in this case, birch saplings, though it doesn't look like there's any here. Just like in the forest cave, we do have birch bushes being placed as a separate feature, but instead of simple block bushes being placed elsewhere, that's where the wildflowers come in, and they're fairly common to help populate some of these more sparse individual grass blocks. Although the ground is mostly diorite in these caves, I do have a separate vegetation patch feature that is entirely grass and just places less commonly. This way we are able to get these more significant grassy sections where you're generally going to be able to find more short grass, as well as hopefully more bushes and wildflowers. In this particular case, looks like we didn't happen to get a whole lot of them. All the wildflowers are sitting around, but that seems to be just a coincidence. As we get lower down in the world, we lose that grass and instead get a vegetation patch that is more similar to what was in the forest, with a mixture of dirt and andesite instead of diorite. We once again still have the short grass and birch saplings getting placed here, but in theory, more sparsely than up above. However, it probably is going to feel a little bit more frequent because there just happens to be more places where they can spawn, thanks to the larger amount of dirt than there is grass. There are still birch bushes down here, but instead of these simple block bushes, we have some brown mushrooms generating in small patches down lower in the birch caves. These changes are right up the alley of what I was aiming for with these biomes. I don't want them to be really different and provide a bunch of different resources in the way that the lush cave biome does, because they aren't really full biomes. It's just to add a little bit of fantasy and excitement and visual intrigue to caving in these particular biomes. There is still more we can do here though. While the caves do have some extra character added to them, we still have these plain old dungeons populating them. They're not bad per se. The cobblestone and the mossy cobblestone doesn't not work with these extra surroundings, and in fact it helps to stand out much more compared to the stone that they could otherwise have been hiding in. But if we're going to be updating the cave specifically to create it's just a more interesting and visual exploration experience, it feels wrong to leave these out. So let's head into a flat world and build some forest and birch forest custom dungeons to help populate these biomes. Here is what I've got for my forest dungeons and my birch dungeons. I have a few different variants of them, and we also have these empty boxes here that have some black wool and chests that I'll get to in a moment. I've designed the forest dungeons to look kind of like trail ruins, even though trail ruins actually spawn in birch dungeons, and that's simply because forests don't have any other solid, non-climbable box to be made up of that I think would be particularly interesting for them. Each variant features a mishmash of various crisscrossing staircases, corridors, doorways, and platforms that all interconnect with each other to create largely one cohesive experience. Some of them are more open than others. The same is true for the birch dungeons, which are made primarily of tough bricks with some smooth stone pillars and polished diorite for trim in a few places. I have one variant of each that features a bridge of chains that go across from one platform to the other. Obviously, there's no reason that the player has to specifically use these chains. They could just build over or build up, and there's even a few variants where building up is expected or required, like right here. These two empty variants at the end aren't going to spawn and are just what I used to help build these and visualize all of the different platform locations that I needed to be accessible. So in every forest dungeon variant, there is a platform at each of these lime wool platforms that is able to be reached by the various staircases or bridges or what have you. And all the other space is fair game to add whatever staircases or hallways I need, or even just completely filled in walls. Now you'll notice there's nothing in these dungeons, and that is where these empty boxes come in. You see, I'm going to be making these dungeons spawn by having them generate as fossil features. Fossils are an incredibly powerful feature, the only feature in Java Edition that allows us to place structure NBT files like these. They do have some limitations, and one of them is that they require both a base structure file as well as what's called an overlay structure file, because they forcefully place the base structure and then an overlay structure on top of it. The reason being, this is how they decided to implement having the main fossil structure be made of bone and then replacing some random amount of it with coal blocks. This is interesting in its own right because both the base structure and the overlay structure do support processors, so the entire thing could have been done with just one processor, but I digress. However, since I have to include both structures anyway, I figured I would separate them in a logical, meaningful way. So the build is the base structure that gets placed, but I do have some processors to replace, for example, some of the stone bricks with mossy or cracked stone bricks, and some of the tough bricks with polished tough. And then the overlay structure that gets placed on top has the chests and the black wool, which gets replaced via the processor with the mob spawners. I've made it so there is a chance for each of these black wool blocks to get replaced with air, but then any remaining black wool blocks have a pretty equal chance to get replaced with a mob spawner for either a zombie, spider, or skeleton. That means technically you could have a dungeon that has all three of a zombie, skeleton, and spider spawner in it, which is pretty cool. There are also 3 chests in these dungeon variants rather than the typical 2, but each of them also has a chance to get replaced with air, and it is higher than the black wool. So you're generally only going to find 1 or 2 chests, and it is possible that you'll find none. Let's plug all these structures into a fossil feature and get it generating underground. Another disadvantage of using fossils for these dungeons is that we can't make them reliably able to connect to caves in any way. I can make it so that if they do happen to generate near caves, that the walls get eroded away so we get these nice openings like we do for the vanilla dungeons, but we aren't able to make it only able to do this. However, we can see here that these dungeons are clearly generating, and in fact both the base structure as well as the overlay structure are generating, and the processor that's actually placing the spawners is working as well. This one looks like only got 2 out of the 3 spawners, and they both happen to be zombies. And then we have 1, 2, and possibly the 3rd chest up here. Looks like maybe only the 2 chests, so that is great. But the processor that is changing some of the stone bricks into cracked and mossy stone bricks is working great, and it looks like we also only got 2 chests in this one, unless I'm missing the 3rd. And it looks like this Birch dungeon just barely missed the cave coming down here that it could have collided with, but that's alright. Looks like we do have a spider spawner in here along with these zombies, so we at least know that that part of the processor is working and we aren't just stuck with a bunch of zombies, though we haven't seen any skeletons yet. These should be way more exciting to find and to fight through, with much more loot, not necessarily better loot, I'm still using the vanilla dungeon loot, but at least potentially more of it, not to mention the incredible utility of having so many potential spawners all in a nearby area to make a really efficient mob grinder. Fossils work so well for their ability to place actual structures as features that I would love to be able to place them here on the surface. They do have yet more limitations though, the main one being that if you try to place them on the surface, even using a height map projection in the placed feature, they tend to try and bury themselves in additional 10-ish blocks underground. This is because of their intended behavior in vanilla deserts and swamps, but it does create some problems if we're trying to make really specific and unique features generate on the surface of custom biomes. However, there is a way around it, so in planning for that, let's go ahead and build a new forest ruin structure that I can have generate as a feature up here. Starting with the structure itself, right now I only have one variant, which I've designed to sort of be almost like it was the ruins of a house. All of the wood has rotted away, and I'm going to use a processor to replace the majority of this mossy cobblestone with regular cobblestone. And then for our overlay structure, I just have a bunch of cobwebs that roughly translate to the area around the inside of the ruins, and then we've got a couple of chests here as well. These chests are going to have a similar processor as the ones in the dungeon, where some of them are going to get replaced with cobwebs, so most of the ruins you find aren't going to have any chests, a few of them might have 1, and if you're very lucky you'll get 2. But their loot is just regular, standard, vanilla house. Forests don't have villages or really any structures that generate in them, so I feel like this is going to add just a little bit of kind of civilization, or the ruins of civilization at least, to help kind of populate them a little bit. Now, like I mentioned, if I'm going to place these with fossils, then I have to contend with the fact that fossil features try to move and offset their placement about 10 blocks or so underground, under at least whatever coordinate they try to generate at, so that ideally they can be buried in things like deserts and swamps. However, not that long ago, Uni in the Stardust Labs Discord realized that since these structures and the overlay structures can have processors applied to them, there exists a processor that you can use to circumvent this, and that is the gravity processor. And the gravity processor does exactly what it says on the tin. It says for every block position, or at least every block column, it applies some gravity to it based on a height map, which does the same thing roughly as using a height map projection placement, but doesn't apply to the whole feature. It applies to the structure that gets placed, which means even though the feature placement might attempt to spawn a little bit underground, the blocks are going to get physically moved up to the surface, or whatever height map you define for it. That means not only is the structure going to actually be on the surface despite being a fossil feature, but it's actually going to stretch and conform to the terrain a little bit, which should add just a little bit of interesting shaping to it. So let's head back to the Overrealm and see if we can get that working. And it looks like we can spot a forest ruin fossil just down there, right on the surface. The terrain here happens to be a little bit hilly, so the doorway here has stretched up a little bit and created somewhat of an awkward shape. But since this structure is intended to be ruins, a player is not necessarily going to be able to tell that any of these blocks are specifically out of place, as opposed to simply removed or having fallen somewhere else. I especially love that we are able to maintain some of the shape of this hill inside of the house, as if some of this terraforming might have occurred well after the structure was abandoned. The processor to replace some of the mossy cobblestone with cobblestone is working great, and as you can see, we also have a processor to replace some of the cobwebs with air. We did get lucky enough to have both chests generating here, so we can see that we do have just regular village loot inside both of these. Nothing crazy like dungeon loot that a player wouldn't be able to find by simply walking around the Overrealm for a little bit. Now, I have given these forest ruins a rarity filter, so they aren't going to spawn in very many chunks, less than the flowers, the desire lines, and even the ponds, which already aren't in a whole lot of chunks when you really think about it. But if you're exploring a sufficiently large forest like this one, chances are pretty good that you're going to happen upon one of these, and it just makes it all the sweeter when you do. I don't think I'm going to add the forest ruins to the birch forest here, because they do already have the trail ruins kind of going for them, and their aesthetic isn't really going to work as nicely in the birch forest as it does in the regular forest. However, that doesn't mean that the birch forests aren't going to get any fossil features. Let's head back into that flat world and build some new fossil features that we can have generate on the surface of both the birch and regular forests. Here I have built the structures for what I'm calling some old tree fossils. This first one is, of course, a big fallen hollow log that you're able to walk through, and even has a hole up in the side here. And then this one is intended to be a really big, old, kind of gnarled tree that has kind of just fallen away with age, that even has a hollow trunk in here that you could hide inside. There's not going to be any loot in these structures, but the overlay structures are filled with a bunch of moss carpets, which I'll use a processor to replace the majority of with air, as well as a very small amount of it with either red or brown mushrooms, so that we get just a little bit of overgrowth on these ancient tree structures. I've built both of them out of oak, but since I have to apply some processors to them anyway for the gravity element, I'm going to have duplicates of the fossil feature for the birch forests that'll use a processor to replace any of the oak logs and oak wood with birch logs and wood. Now, unlike for the forest ruins, I don't necessarily want these tree structures, these fossils, to conform to the terrain. I still want them to be on the surface, but I don't want this like huge fallen log, for example, to melt along with the hill. It would kind of ruin the effect of walking through a big empty hollow log. So to handle that, we have a further extension of the trick discovered by Uni that incorporates the gravity processor with feature stacking. So loading in, we can already see a couple of things are working as expected. We obviously have this big empty log fossil feature getting placed. The processor to turn the oak logs into birch logs is working, as well as the processor to replace most of this moss carpet with air. The key thing to note here is that although this fossil feature is on a hill and is even partially embedded in it, we have this part over here that is hanging off the hill and not melting along to conform with it. I have some red concrete marker blocks up here in the sky that you can see kind of all around, indicating that I'm using marker block feature stacking to place these fossil features once again. And you can even see that we have a couple of birch logs just underneath these because they're getting caught underneath the concrete block as part of the height map. There's a hole in the log down there. That's something that'll be easy to fix by simply applying an additional random offset to the vegetation feature that the vegetation patch that's getting placed on here is placing, so that it isn't directly underneath this marker block. However, unlike when I showcased the marker block feature stacking method with the pawns earlier, this is already a full feature stack that has 2 or more features in it. If I give myself a light block, you'll see that there's some kind of incompatibility with one of my mods that's causing the light blocks to look like, I think, sugarcane? But more importantly, there is a disk of light blocks above this whole empty log fossil. Just like with the forest ruins, this empty log fossil feature is conforming to a height map, but it's using the light blocks, this disk of light blocks that gets placed earlier in the feature stack as the highest block in that height map, and then is getting offset from that about 12 blocks below. Because the disk is perfectly flat, that means that every coordinate, every column of the feature stays in the same configuration as the original structure was saved, minus the extra blocks that get caught by the height map way up at the top of the world. And then they simply get moved down from that height map to look like they are getting embedded in the actual terrain. This is the true power of combining both fossil features and feature stacking. It allows us to place essentially any small structure as a feature on the surface with or without terrain conformity as much as we desire. The reason that the marker blocks are still up in the sky is because I'm going to make one more feature to actually remove these light blocks by simply placing another disk at the same time that the marker block gets removed. That'll be simple enough to implement, so before I demonstrate it, let's talk about what we're going to do for the Windswept forest and the old-growth birch forest biomes. I want the old-growth birch forest to feel truly tall and old and majestic, not unlike the old-growth taigas. So we're definitely going to want to make use of these larger birch trees in much higher frequency. However, for the same reason that we don't want a lot of the rooted birch trees in the regular birch forest, we don't necessarily want these to be super duper common, the most common tree in this forest. So I think I'm going to make a variant of the rootless birch tree that is just much taller and also has a wider brim. That'll be the most common tree in the old-growth birch taiga, with these mega fancy birch trees more common than they are in the birch forest, but not so dominant that you just completely ruin the visual aesthetic of walking through and walking on the ground of the biome. Most everything else is probably going to be pretty much the same as the existing birch forest. However, I think I am going to make those fossil features much more common here than they are in the regular birch forest. The Windswept forest, however, is not going to have those old tree fossils, or indeed the forest ruin fossils, simply because it's just way too hilly that most of them just wouldn't look very good here. I also don't plan on including any desire lines in the Windswept forest, since because of the hilly nature of it, reasonably people would be traveling here much less, animals would be traveling here much less, and generally along different paths as the terrain kind of morphs and shifts. Which means that despite not having any features specifically unique to the Windswept forest, it should feel noticeably different from the regular forest biome because it's going to be way thicker with those trees and not have any of those same kind of older dead trees or ruins. It should be kind of like untouched nature. It looks like we conveniently have a windswept forest and an old-growth birch forest right next to each other, so let's get all those implemented and we can take a look at them together. Oh my, yes, this paints a very different picture. The grass and foliage colors here in the Windswept forest are different enough from the regular forest biome colors to give this place a whole different feel and vibe. It feels generally much colder, and because we don't have those desire lines or ponds here, it's also much more dense and just vegetative all around. The hills even allow these much older, fancier trees with their longer roots to have even more just kind of attention called to them. Unfortunately, it looks like we ended up getting some dripstone caves underneath this biome, so we don't get to see the fancy forest caves down here, but I have given them the same cave features as the regular forest has. Moving on to the old growth birch taiga, this is, I think, the first biome that I would say actually looks pretty nice from above. The extra density added by all the leaves that are just a little bit thicker, wider brim than the regular birch forest gives this just a little bit of an older kind of feel to it, which is of course the idea. Down here on the ground, we still get very much the same kind of sense as the vanilla birch forest, but because these trees tend to be much taller, the leaves are even a little bit more offset than in the regular birch forest, and we obviously still have these thicker, fancier birch trees, but in much higher frequency, means that you still get the sense that this is an old growth birch forest as compared to the regular birch forest. And that should only be aided by the fact that you'll find gnarled trees like this much more often here. We still get the moss carpet on the roots and in the opening of the trunk here, as well as even some up here on these old branches. We'll fly around a little bit and see if we can find some more of those fossils here on the old growth surface. Yep, there's an empty log, didn't take too long at all. I did forget to move them over a little bit, so we still have those floating birch logs up in the sky. And then the old growth birch forest once again has those same cave features that the regular birch forest has, and I don't think that's a problem. We are nearly done updating all the forest biomes. It's time to go and take a look at the flower forest and see how we want it to differ from the regular and windswept forests. The main thing flower forests are known for is of course the many flowers that are placed throughout them, and once again these flowers are placed by a random patch feature. However, what some players may not realize is that the random patch feature that places them, and in fact the random patch feature that gets placed when players use bone meal in a flower forest, uses a noise provider for its state provider to change which flowers get placed based on the location in the world. So in certain areas of the flower forest, you will only be able to find and indeed grow white tulips versus orange tulips versus red tulips versus pink tulips. And this should be very easy to replicate even as I completely do away with the random patch aspect of this placement and instead handle them similarly to how I'm doing the ferns and grass and such in the other forest biomes. This should mean that you won't tend to get flowers in patches like this. They'll be much more kind of evenly distributed throughout, but you'll still have these areas where all the flowers are red tulips, for example. We're going to use all the same trees from the regular forest here, including both birch trees and these oak trees that have little root footprints around them and much more natural cherry foliage providers for their leaves. However, unlike with my forest biome, I'm not going to have these be super duper dense and common. In fact, they're probably going to end up being less common than they are in vanilla flower forests. I do think I'll do something interesting with them. I might use something like a weighted state provider for the number provider for the actual count of how many trees attempt to get placed per chunk, so that we get some areas where they're a little bit more dense and some areas where they are quite sparse, just to draw more attention to these flowers here on the ground. However, to help fill in some of those gaps where the trees won't be, I do think I want to incorporate some bushes of azalea and obviously chiefly flowering azalea, even though there may not be any lush caves below these bushes. In my first Dwarf Hollow video a while back, a lot of people were asking about my honeycomb caves and where the bees were going to get their pollen. And a lot of people don't realize that flowering azalea, even though they're leaf blocks, count as flowers for what bees will pathfind towards and attempt to get pollen from. They count as flowers, and I think they look nice and will add a little bit of extra texturing and character to the flower forest, so I'm going to have these small bushes generate here, along with the regular flowers. Because this biome will be less dense, I don't feel any need to incorporate desire lines or ponds or anything, and I'm probably also not going to do any of those fossil features here in the flower forest, because I really want the focus to be, again, on the flowers, even more so than in the vanilla flower forest. And that's why I want the caves underground to also be very heavily grassed, even more so than the birch caves, again to have even more focus drawn to the noise-based flowers. We will probably still pepper this with something like granite just to give it a little bit extra texturing, but I think altogether this should make for a really pretty looking underground area. Let's get all those features made so we can round out this forest makeover. I was hoping I was going to be able to say something along the lines of, "This is so pretty." But once again, I think this is a biome that doesn't really look very good from the sky. Let's get down on the ground and see how it really looks. Okay. This is so pretty. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you can hear, but I am smiling so wide seeing all these flowers. The distribution is working great. There are flowers literally everywhere, but they aren't in clear clusters and patches as far as like individual placements of the flowers, but you are seeing them in clusters and groups based on color. So we have this whole section here that's all red flowers, and I think by pure coincidence, these rose bushes. But then as we move over here, we've got some lines of orange, and then we get into some, I think, pink tulips over here. Yep, pink tulips, and then maybe even some white as we get over here. I think especially when we have trees that are super sparse like this, the azalea bushes add just a little bit of verticality and texturing to the hillside and to the ground so that it doesn't just look like a bunch of flat terrain that has some flowers and ferns and things. But where the trees do get a little bit more dense, we do tend to see a little bit more of the podzol stretching out from them, and the ferns and bushes and things tend to make a little bit more sense as well, but never losing sight of those flowers covering the whole area. I would understand if anyone said this doesn't really feel like a forest anymore, but I've always felt that flower forest shouldn't feel very much like a forest of trees, but like a forest of flowers, and I think that this covers that very, very well. As we travel down in the caves, not seeing as many flowers as I would like, but I do like the way the grass works with the granite here. I do still have some of the short grass and the oak saplings generating as the vegetation feature for these vegetation patches. That way, the flowers that do spawn here can have that noise-based simple block placement. We are seeing some flowers here, so I am pretty satisfied with it, but I might increase those just a little bit more later on. As we get below deep slate level, we do lose the grass blocks in favor of a mixture of dirt and coarse dirt, as well as some clay mixed in as well. I felt like that kind of made sense based on some of the implications left by the lush caves, and of course the azalea bushes up on the surface. We do still have the flowers down here though. They are a little bit less common since we are deeper in the world, but I still wanted them to be very prominent, and of course they are still following that noise-based selector. And we also have a chance for azalea bushes to generate down here as part of the same feature that handles the flowers. I think this has been a very successful and satisfying start to the Overrealm, and I'm interested to see what I can come up with for some future vanilla biomes. Remember to let me know in the comments what biomes you'd like to see overhauled next. If you've enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen, structures, and data pack content. If you're excited to explore the forests of the Overrealm, please consider joining my Patreon to get early access. If you'd like to get started learning custom world gen yourself, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide hosted by Datapack Hub. Congratulations to today's winner, Robin Pascaud, and thanks for watching!